Thank you, Professor Maluleke, for that very kind introduction. Greetings to the entire community of the University of Johannesburg. I will forgive you too for not being Wits, but I love you because I am originally from Johannesburg, so I still see myself as a visitor in Pretoria because my original home is in Johannesburg. A special greeting goes to the program director, Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University. Also, I would like to extend a special greeting to the executive management of the University of Johannesburg and membership of the entire academia of this university. But my most special greeting goes to the students of the University of Johannesburg, because my understanding is that today's forum is about you. It is the Young African Leaders Forum. And I liked the fact that you called it a leaders forum, not future leaders, and I'll get to that later. Greetings to the media and to the special guests that join us this morning, and to the Public Protector team that is accompanying me this morning. And thank you to the young ladies and gentlemen that sang and danced for us this morning. That was really special. I wished I had my phone to take a picture of you guys. I didn't, but I have a very good memory of what you did. It really is a great honor to stand here before you today, particularly to address young leaders. In the past, we called young people future leaders, and we were wrong on two grounds. Firstly, that was the understanding that you become a leader when you get a position to lead, whereas you are a leader wherever you are. You can be in a leadership position but not be a leader, but you are a leader even if you are a 3-year-old at a preschool. The second reason we were wrong was because every day society has different needs, and different needs are solved by different leaders. We just spoke right now about Twitter. Just the entire network, the entire internet that we speak about today was created by young people. We speak about Facebook today. How old was that young person when he created Facebook, which today we claim we can't live without? And yesterday I met a young fellow who's going to be the second African on space and the first black person from Africa on space. He's a young person, Maseko. On the issue that I'm supposed to talk to you about today, I am here to speak about the importance of governance and ethical principles in leadership, looking at lessons from recent Public Protector reports. I thought I would start that particular conversation by reflecting on a biblical experience, but with no intention to offend Buddhists, Muslims, and others. Just reflecting it on as an incident without taking a religious perspective on it. You recall that the children of Israel were led by Moses from Egypt. That's history as well. Even if you don't want to look at it from a religious perspective, we can still look at it from a historical perspective. You will also recall that it was a glorious moment the day the children of Israel left Egypt, because Egypt was oppressive to them. And Egypt today has become the symbol of what is oppressive, but not Egypt the country, but the concept of Egypt. You will also recall, though, that we are told, at least biblically, I'm not sure historically if it's true, but biblically, we're told that the children of Israel took 40 years to cross over from Egypt to the promised land of Israel. If you take the map, of course, they were not flying, they were not driving, they were walking, but they should have still been able to do it at most within 6 months, at most. But they took 40 years. We've been a free nation for 20 years. We will be taking our next 20 years of democracy, which will give us 40 years of democracy. We have to ask ourselves, we've made the journey out of the oppressive state, and we can see the distance between where we were and where we are, as the children of Israel could see themselves when they were in the desert. There was a clear distance between where they were and where they were at that moment. The issue we have to ask ourselves, as they continued to ask themselves, I suppose, during those 40 years, was, should we be where we are? We clearly have moved from where we were, but are we in the right place? Or could we have covered more distance? As we traverse the next 20 years of democracy, we would have to ask ourselves, and many of you would have left this university, you young people, and you'd be participating more meaningfully in this journey of taking us from where we are to where we should be. I'm not saying you're not participating right now. You are participating. Even if you're not doing anything, you're still participating. Because not doing anything when you're supposed to be doing something is doing something. There's no neutrality. So the reality is we're all co-creators of our future, or of our destiny. And the point, though, that I'm making now is we have another 20 years of doing it. The proposition I'm going to give to you, or to put to you, without being very rude, is we've traveled a great distance from where we were in 1994 to where we are in terms of achieving the constitutional promise of an improved quality of life for every South African and freed potential of every person. That's a given. But part of my proposition is that we have covered less ground than we could have covered if it wasn't for maladministration. You will ask me, what has maladministration got to do with importance of governance and ethical and principles of ethical leadership? I will take you to that story. I want to talk to you then about 9 things, just based on that theory, that we've done well, but we could have done much better if it wasn't for maladministration. And in the next 20 years, to avoid being in the desert, we will have to tackle maladministration effectively. Then our pace will be as good as our intentions. What is ethical leadership and what is good governance is what I'm going to talk very briefly to you about. Why is it important that we should be talking about governance and ethical leadership? What are the contents of these two concepts, ethical leadership and good governance? Who bears the responsibility for good governance and ethical leadership? That's my 6th one. The 7th issue I'll talk about is very quickly, what's the gap between where we should be in terms of good governance and ethical leadership? Drawing on case studies, just very quickly on some of the case studies that we've dealt with as the Public Protector South Africa. The 8th thing will be what is to be done. And the 9th issue is what are the potential partnerships that could exist between civil society, government, and business in ensuring that there is good governance at all levels of society, not just in government, at all levels of society. Right. What is ethical leadership? I thought because I was going to academia, I was not going to invent my own definition, because I was told that there were many learned people here, master's degrees, doctorates, etc., who will study forever what I said and find out whether it has resonance with what is in the books. I therefore took this book, written by a professor of law, or a professor from the University of Stellenbosch, William Fox. He talks about ethics, but public ethics here, because that's the area where I work as a public protector. Public ethics, he says, public ethics refers to the area of ethics regarding the matter of how humans choose to live together within the many networks of relationships that comprise the sum of our lives. A number of ethical questions may be termed private, to which the individual has to pay attention and to which cannot or cannot hardly be taken over by anyone else. For example, exercise and nutrition. But other ethical questions are common to both the public and private domains, such as when we act with our family or partner or as a friend. I would like us to pay attention to the last sentence I'm going to read on ethics, is that in a more public sense would be our driving the actions we approve or disapprove and our neighborhood actions. So actions are the rules that somehow regulate our coexistence. And when we're talking about public, in the public sphere, we're not talking public sector. For example, often when we talk about public accountability, we often think that public accountability is for people in government. Corporations have public accountability, universities, NGOs, etc. Public accountability is that phase of accountability where you're not accounting to your family or friends, where you're accounting publicly, not institutionally. So ethics is really the rules that regulate our relationships as we coexist in our diversity. Why is it important? Or maybe I should talk about governance. Governance, obviously, we're talking about the way institutions and societies are managed, regulated, and services delivered. But the governance part is how all of that is regulated, led, and controlled. That would be the governance side of things. When we talk about good governance, we talk about governance practices that are in line with the law, that are ethical, that are principled, that are responsive to the needs of the governed, and that more than anything else, though, are regulated by the understanding of the concept that public power is exercised as borrowed power. It's not your power, somebody else has power. Which takes me to the why, which is my third issue, is the issue of why should we be concerned about governance and ethical principles. 2 years ago, I visited a high school in Lodium, and I met there with students or learners that are members of the SRC, of the student body. They had their own rules. Forget about the university rules. They had their own rules. And in their own rules, they had their own ethics, and they held each other accountable. And I asked the young people, why do you have these rules? They said, we come from different backgrounds and we have different views on what is right and what is wrong. These rules were brought together to become the glue that binds us, so that each of one knows what is right and what is wrong here. It might be right in a shebeen somewhere, it might be right elsewhere, but here as a group, these are the rules that would regulate right and wrong. I was reflecting on what I was going to say today, and I thought about those young people and the way they had come up with their own code of conduct and their own sense of what is ethical, what is acceptable, what is right, and their willingness to enforce those ethics. And then came back to ethics in the sphere of the public sector and society. Again, those are rules where you regulate conduct amongst yourselves, but you yourselves determine what is going to be right and what is going to be wrong. It's not an outsider. Ethics are not the same thing as criminal law, where you might not have a say on what's crime. Somebody else decides. For example, here we're existing as a university, we're subject to the criminal law, we're subject to civil law, but this university has its own ethical code. You yourself have voluntarily decided this is how we are going to behave, because ethics regulate behavior more than anything else, individual behavior. What is acceptable behavior, what is unacceptable behavior, and what are we going to do when there is unacceptable behavior? Governance, again, I would assume that this university and you as student bodies and various associations that you belong to, including Stokvel associations, there are rules. In a Stokvel, you may have rules, for example, that says everyone must pay their 500 Rand at the end of the month. And if you haven't paid, there are consequences for that. That's what allows people to regulate these various networks within which they coexist. What is then the content of ethics and governance? Simply put then, the content of ethics is just simple rules on behavior, acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior. It's do's and don'ts. It could be at home. You could have your own code of ethics. Usually it's an unwritten code of ethics at your house. But there are rules in your house. There is the Madonsela way, there is the Dlamini way, there's the Fundamental way. You could do it next door. You hear parents say, I don't want that child at my house because I know what they do at his house. But it's simply because they're distinguishing between what is acceptable at this house and what is acceptable at that house. But again, what we have to take with us is those ethics are defined by the players. That community, each community, small or big, defines its own rules of governance and its own ethics. That is to allow coexistence, smooth coexistence, because imagine if we all lived together and I took as much space as I wanted. There would be less space for you. So the idea is to regulate so that we can share the space. In society, the whole notion of being governed comes from the idea of society needing to share their destiny, share their resources, so that because of the understanding that together they have a better chance of survival as a species. And we know the only species that does that. I think ants do the same thing. They have a way of regulating themselves and for the better survival of the species. But in that context of then being part of a group and having rules that regulate your behavior, you have to abandon some of your freedoms, because there's certain things you can't do. There's certain things you have to do also in a limited way. There are certain things you can do. For example, if you live in a community, you can't just make noise. Those of you who live in residences, you can't just make noise. You have a right to play music in your house, but you can't play it in such a way that it interferes with your neighbor's space. Those would be the rules that govern us in a community to ensure that we coexist. But in this community, those are ethics that govern everyone. But then there are ethics that would govern a few in the community. Going back again, I'm going back to that SRC group where they said we are diverse and therefore we need to have shared rules, and we have shared values and rules that regulate our behavior. The other issue that those young people informed me was that they also have to be exemplary. Because the ones I met with the SRC as I started, we have to be exemplary to the student body that we regulate. You have to have rules for yourselves that make sure that you don't embarrass yourselves to those that you regulate, because they will judge you more harshly. Judges are always judged more harshly. Gatekeepers, that's what happens to us. As Chapter 9 institutions, you get judged. Judges themselves, like literal court judges, are judged more harshly. That's one of the reasons that these young ones had those ethical rules. Who bears the responsibility? Thank you. Who bears the responsibility for making the rules? The rules would be made by those who are entrusted with the power to regulate the community in consultation with the community. That would be how societies are regulated, how mini communities are regulated. You make those rules in consultation with society. But within those rules, then we have different roles. Going back to the example of the SRC, those in the highest positions now have a responsibility not only to regulate themselves, but to regulate the rest of society. They become keepers. They become custodians of how the rest of society is supposed to behave. Let's now take it home to where we are in government. I'm here speaking to you as a public protector, a member of a group of institutions created by the Constitution of South Africa to support and strengthen constitutional democracy. Traditionally, democracy had three pillars, what they call the trias politica. It was parliament, the executive, and the courts. Over years, it was discovered that that's great. That's an excellent arrangement. But the architecture had flaws. In Sweden, then they discovered that there was a need to inject something into the architecture of good governance and democracy, and they brought in an ombudsman. In South Africa, we brought in an ombudsman, which is the public protector, plus other institutions supporting constitutional democracy. They're not political, like parliament. They're not executive, or they're not administrative, like the executive. They're not judicial. They are, lawyers would call them an entity that is sui generis. It's unique in its own nature. They use administrative action, administrative scrutiny to curb excesses in the exercise of state power. They complement what already exists in the traditional system, but their role is administrative oversight. In other countries, they supervise, and I think supervise sounds more like the school principal. So we would talk about administrative oversight, and they support Parliament to do that. Those are the roles, but excuse me, but that role is still secondary. Because going back to the issue of the SRC that I spoke about, the duty to ensure you do the right thing is firstly internal to the individuals, and secondly, the responsibility of that collective to regulate itself. If you're Parliament, it's your duty to make sure that you do the right thing, and you supervise each other to make sure you do the right thing. If you're the judiciary, it's the same thing. If you're the executive, it's the same thing. The Chapter 9 institutions come in as a second layer just to assist you to do the right thing, when you yourself are regulating yourself to make sure that you do the right thing. So you bear the responsibility to do the right thing. You bear the responsibility to make the rules. Chapter 9 institutions don't make the rules, as I have said recently. Where do the rules come from? If we go back to the SRC, they were made by the SRC, but they had to take a leaf from the code of conduct of the school itself. So they wouldn't come up with rules that would make them to be at odds, their behavior to be at odds with the institutions. In South Africa, if you're looking at the rules that govern the work of the executive, the legislature, and the courts, broadly, the main source of rules, it's the Constitution. In South Africa, we have the Constitution that clearly defines what kind of a country do we want to become. It lays down the vision of society, and part of that vision is an improved quality of life for every person and freed potential of every person. In that vision, it also stipulates specifically some of the tangibles that every citizen is going to enjoy. You will see those in the Bill of Rights, where there is the right to human dignity, the right to equality, and various other civil and political rights. It also includes rights as socio-economic rights, the right to food, the right to access to health services, to health care, the right to access to social security, the right to access to education, etc. Those are rights that are promised by the Constitution. So to get those rights, delivery of those rights is not a gift, it's not welfare, it's keeping the promise, the Constitution. It then sets out the character of the state that has to deliver on those rights. The Constitution recognizes, if you look at the preamble, that we start from a past of a state that wasn't just and didn't deliver to all. And it then talks about a state that is accountable, responsive, operates with integrity. It talks about a state that is transparent. In Section 1 of the Constitution, you will find that in Section 1 of the Constitution, open democracy is one of the foundational values of our society. Section 195 talks about principles of public administration. They're not applicable to public servants only. Everyone who's going to work with public power and public resources has to stick to those. They include accountability, responsiveness, economic use of resources, and putting people first. Because these resources, of course, like the SRC that I'm talking about, was there to help to regulate the affairs of the student body, and therefore whatever it does should be for the benefit of the student and as little as possible for itself, to maintain itself in order to be able to serve the student community. Lastly, on the character of the state, Lastly, on the character of the state is Section 237, which is not well known, but it says Section 237 enjoins those in the state to ensure that constitutional responsibilities are implemented as a priority, are given priority in implementation, and that they are implemented diligently. In other words, everything that's already promised in the Constitution, you are required to implement diligently and give it a priority. I always say that in the next 20 years, you would have then to think twice before you beautify, for example, a freeway or something like that. You would have to think about a toilet for a child who's going to die in Limpopo and beautify a freeway. How do you maintain those resources? I'm simplifying it, of course, because you might want to beautify the freeway as a tourist attraction to create jobs for people. I'm just talking, there are some things that you have to weigh and say, should I do this one, or is there an economic way of doing it so that I can have money to give priority to constitutional promises as required by Section 237. What is the gap between the promise and the reality? Lastly, on the character of the state, we also have Section 96, which talks about the executive and ethical conduct that is required of the executive. And part of that is really putting public interest first and self-interest last, or there should be no self-interest to start with. Very quickly, some of the gaps that we've picked up in public administration, in ethics, is that we have an executive ethics code that comes from the Executive Members Ethics Act. when people are appointed, they obviously are given copies of these documents, but there aren't conversations around what really then is the behavior that is in line with this. As we saw in the SRC, where they then come together and discuss regularly what conduct is required. In this particular case, we have picked up that gap. The other gap that I have picked up, which I've indicated in one of the reports that were released recently, the one that caused a lot of trouble, which is called Secure in Comfort. The gap is our code of ethics is very, very broad. It leaves it to the group itself to interpret and to give it details. In that report, I've included the code of ethics of the US. They have one code of ethics, generic one, above the institutional code of ethics, and it has 10 things. 10 things, it's almost like the oath, like what people would swear to on oath. Everyone who works for the state, whether they work there as a politician or work as an official, they are supposed to be bound by that code of ethics. It includes avoiding self-interest. It includes looking after resources of the state. In other words, you have a responsibility. You can't say, she's wasting the resources and I'm standing here. It becomes your job to look after resources of the state. If time permits later, I can refer to the actual code. I quoted it verbatim in the report. I have said that we probably need something like that because we are a transitional democracy, and perhaps just as the children of Israel needed those 10 commandments. And if you remember, they didn't have the 10 commandments when they left Egypt. The 10 commandments came when it became clear that people were doing their own thing. And there needed to be a basis for pulling everyone together. At the moment, there's a basis for pulling all of us together, being the Constitution, to start with, the laws. But when you come down to the detail of how do we behave on a day-to-day basis, as we have seen in some of these reports, we need to get finer details. It doesn't mean that we have a gap in terms of there's nothing. It just means a lot of it then depends on interpretation. And to narrow that room for different interpretations, we need a code that is more specific in terms of the do's and don'ts for members of this particular group. The other gap, I'm just talking to ethics. Examples you will see, we did the ethics of staying in comfort. See two different reactions. The ethics of staying in comfort and secure in comfort. Ethics of staying in comfort, there's a minister who's accused of sleeping at the One and Only. It's too expensive. Say, why? Why did you sleep at this hotel? It's too expensive. You should have noticed that it was too expensive. You should have asked questions. Minister responds and said, I did ask the questions. Here's the evidence. But not only did I ask the questions, I requested to be downgraded the following day. Here's the evidence. And thirdly, I then requested my department to create a policy that prevents this thing occurring in future, where there's no exploration of something that's comfortable, dignified, but not excessive. He did that and accepted our scrutiny and comes back and says, I'm happy to abide with whatever else you say I should do, which we did indicate what extra things should be done, and then we all accepted, we moved forward, and it was fun. Then we did in the extreme, where the one minister not only felt that he needed to sleep at these expensive hotels, he also brought not so relative relatives and argued for a new definition of what a father is, and slept at state expense when he wasn't on duty and said he was told by his staff that he's the property of the state, and whenever he travels, it should be at state expense. And again, we made a finding, and the minister concerned was very unhappy that we made a finding. Same executive, member of the executive, same set of circumstances, same rules. One person accepts being corrected, one person does not accept being corrected. Say, the ethics of staying in comfort, I'm not going to talk about it because we haven't received a response yet, but the response that we've heard is from the public. Remember, these are supposed to be ethics that not just guide the SRC, they guide the student body. So if we use the comparison, we are now the example and equivalent to the student body. It's our resources. There have been people from the public in that particular report that have been saying, public protector, resign. Same situation, I did the same situation as in the ethics of staying in comfort. Just say this was excessive, some of it must go back. Incidentally, the Auditor General did the same thing with one minister where a wall was built for 200,000 instead of 100,000. He said the extra 100,000 needed to come back. Those are the gaps between the promise and how people implement. And as a society, we need them to be true to what is it really that we regard as right and what is it that we regard as wrong. And when we are then going to criticize, are we going to criticize the referee or are we going to criticize the red-carded parties? On maladministration, on the issue of governance, the issue of governance goes beyond ethics. It goes beyond ethical leadership. It is an issue around how do we follow the rules, how do we, in management you talk about doing right things right. Really good governance is about that, doing the right things right. Not making a choice between right things and right processes, getting the process right and the outcomes right. Do processes matter? Processes do matter. Because once you start ignoring the processes, everyone ignores the process. And then you have people dancing in different directions. There is no choreography. It becomes anarchy, and we don't get the results that we want. That's why those things matter. But what happens when we break rules? I will just give you examples of just very quick stories when we break rules. Against the rules that we spoke about, they were going to hire buildings at about 500,000 over 10 years each, which buildings had been bought by the guy around the same time as he was getting the tender. He was negotiating the purchase of the building at 20 million rand. That one ended up with a report, it ended up in court. Fortunately, in the Northwest, we had a similar thing where something similar to that was happening around the same time. Their ethical leadership, when we dealt with the Premier, she stepped in and said, you are right, we can't pay this money. Let's cancel this tender and let's negotiate to buy this building on our own instead of losing the money. I can give you various other examples. Dipali saying you get a situation where there are rules on how you should employ people. You've got to employ people for certain positions, you advertise and you employ them because they have specific competences. Those rules were broken with key people such as the municipal manager and chief financial officer. Rules were also broken when it came to procuring people to deliver RDP housing. One of the most interesting stories one would ever tell on RDP housing is Nala in Free State, where somebody built toilets with piping that ended right in front of the toilets. I mean, for you to have a waterborne ablution system or sewerage system, the system has to go into a main pipe that takes the excrement somewhere. And perhaps right up to the sea. I don't know where it goes to, but it must go somewhere. In this particular case, it went nowhere, literally. All of the pipes were ending right in front of the door. Keys given to the people, and then this was delivered. Somebody got paid. You would have expected that before he got paid, somebody would have gotten in, flushed the toilets and see if they flushed. And in this case, they wouldn't flush because there's no system, there's no flushing system. But the person was paid. I'm going back to the issue of 40 years maladministration, bad governance, and 40 years. Is that what has happened there is that by the time we came there, the government was then paying for a sewerage system which was a bucket system. It has paid for the waterborne one, it's a white elephant. It was paying for a bucket system. And the bucket system itself was dysfunctional. They were paid to collect these buckets for a certain number of times per week, but they didn't do so. But they got paid for them. And then people took to the streets, which undermines democracy. Going forward, they've had to pay again to fix the bucket system, to fix the water plant. By the time we left there, we needed at least 50 million to fix the system. But the system had already been paid for several years ago. Lots of stories can be told about RDP houses, where somebody says, I built 200 houses, whereas in fact they built 120. They get paid for 200 houses. They pocket money for 200. They pocket money for 80 that they didn't build. You could say they are being shortchanged by people from outside, but they're not being shortchanged by people from outside because we have a system, we have our own rules that tell you how do you procure. Firstly, you have to procure somebody with a track record who knows what they're doing. But secondly, when do you pay? There has to be a quality control process first. Engineers have to check that what was delivered is according to specs, and only on signature you have to pay. You also have to retain some of the money for a limited period of time, and after that period of time, and the NHRPC has checked that there was proper delivery, then you can pay. Minister of Human Settlements is spending billions on a program that is called the rectification program. That program is simply, in some towns, they've stopped building new houses. There's no budget for building new houses. The only budget is for rectification. They're fixing the old RDP houses that they paid for. So that's double payment. But the interesting thing is that we're getting stories and proven stories that even the rectifiers, some of them are being paid for doing a shoddy job. So there'll be, I don't know what we'll call the rectification of the rectification program. But fortunately, some people, I know of a province where the premier wore the overalls and went to count the houses. After his staff had come back and said all of the houses were there. But the community was saying, no, not all of the houses were there. He went there and counted and found that the community was right. I'm not saying the system is falling apart. I'm saying in parts of it, when people ignore the rules, things fall apart. But when ethical leadership steps in, good governance step in, you can fix the system. But if you fix it after we've lost the money, then there will be less money for building a school, a bridge, and a hospital. Talking about the gap, our RDP housing hearings have shown that there's still children that are living in places where there are no school days. They don't go to school because there are no bridges or the roads are bad. If they go to school, they would die because they would have to try and swim. If we improve maladministration, if we improve on maladministration and improve on good governance, we can claw back some of the money going forward to make sure that we don't have to rectify what we already have paid for. Which takes me to what is to be done. What is to be done? The first thing on the issue of ethics, we've already made a suggestion in Parliament. When Parliament had an ethics discourse led by Professor Turok and Mr. Mashile, who are co-chairpersons of the Joint Parliamentary Ethics Committee, we made a proposal that we need a generic code of ethics that applies across the board, beyond the institutional ethics codes. So this one would apply to parliamentarians, apply to members of the executive, public servants, Chapter 9 institutions, judges, cleaners, and everyone. As long as you work for the state, there should be those minimum things. And then obviously the health people will then have an elaborated code that deals with the fact that they're health people, the lawyers, etc. That's one of the recommendations we've made. Secondly, ensuring there's no impunity. Most organizations do the right thing when the cleaner fails to clean. Meaning we know what is the right thing. When the driver goes somewhere else with a company car and the car gets bashed, we know what to do, most organizations. But many organizations, not all, many organizations struggle when it is one of the seniors who has done something wrong. However, for the system to hold, we need to be consistent and ensure there's no impunity, that the messages are the same, that there's political will regardless of who the parties are involved. Lastly, the messages that are sent, what I talk about leadership messages. The messages that are sent about leadership, by leadership, on what is right and wrong should be consistent. It shouldn't be it's wrong because it was done by X, and it's not wrong if it's done by Y. For the organization or institutions and the state to function as a whole, we need to have that consistency in messaging. Lastly, the Auditor General has proposed that organizations could have their own ethical leadership self-assessment matrix, where you decide in your own organization what are the 10 things, behavioral things that we want. And occasionally you then do your own self-assessment on, are we complying? Because ethics is an inside-out job. You can do the same thing with good governance and have your own self-assessment matrix where yearly you check yourself. In that way, you don't have to wait for Chapter 9 institutions or the audit committee. Perhaps the audit committee could work with you in doing that. A glimmer of hope going forward is Chapter 14 of the National Development Plan. You'll notice that in Chapter 14, it talks about what's wrong when it comes to ethics, corruption, bad governance, etc. It talks about what's right as well. But it then makes recommendations on what needs to be improved. And I think that is an opportunity for us to key into and saying we can revitalize our efforts around good governance and ethical governance to ensure that the implementation of the NDP does not suffer the kinds of delays that we've seen. That will make sure that we don't take 40 years to ensure that no child studies under a tree and no child dies in a toilet, in a pit toilet, because we can't afford a proper toilet. Thank you.